1204th day of the war, Ukraine continues to knock out the Russian defense industry. Last night, a drone attack on the Tambov powder plant. Local residents demonstrate footage of a fire, as well as videos on which explosions are heard. The head of the Pentagon, Hegseth, said that the United States would reduce the support of Ukraine in the new defense budget. He said it looks pretty strange because there is no support for Ukraine in this budget. What does he mean? It is not clear, although given the specifics of the new American administration and specifically Hegseth, perhaps this is just a random set of words. Europe is seriously afraid that Russia can conduct hybrid military operations on the territory of the Baltic countries, in particular Estonia, and this is quite possible. Now, when Trump literally refuses the obligation of the United States of NATO, it is a tempting moment for Putin to check the strength of the fifth article of the Stava alliance. After the Peacock operation, Russia moves its strategic aviation away from Ukraine. This directly affects the ability of the Kremlin to launch missile strikes. However, the main weapon of terror are strike drones, which are used by the RF to strike civil objects of Ukraine, terrorizing the population of the country. You can support this and much more in a fresh summary, which you can support with your likes, comments, and subscription to the channel. Your subscriptions are especially important for YouTube algorithms. This is one of the main indicators. You can support the channel financially on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. And by buying NVPN, this is a means to bypass blocking, which we do with the team, so that you have the opportunity to watch YouTube at normal speed, read Twitter, watch Instagram, and go to the sites of blocked media. The state should not decide what to watch, listen, read. NVPN allows you to return control in your hands. It is legal to use VPN. To buy VPN in Russia is allowed so far, and it allows you to bypass all blocking, so buy it by the link in the description. With rubles, foreign currencies, cryptocurrencies in general, any convenient way for you, and thus you support the release of new videos on this channel. Well, we are moving on to what happened in the last 24 hours. Many of you have probably read the news about the statement of the U.S. Defense Minister Peter Hegseth about the reduction of aid to Ukraine in the U.S. budget for the next year. For all those who closely follow American policy and are concerned with Ukraine, an economical question arose: what kind of help is there? If new packages have not been allocated to Trump and are not planned to be allocated, what is the matter here? Tells the channel B or. As for Hegseth's statement, he writes that the financing of military aid to Ukraine will be reduced in the U.S. defense budget for the 26th year. The news is out of the blue. There's nothing to be reduced there. It can be said about 300 million Ukrainians on the USAI program, long-term contracts that usually include the U.S. defense budget. They did so in the 24th and 25th years, so they probably want to reduce them. Well, what can I say here? As you understand, 300 million from the U.S. will not play a big role. Just for comparison, I add to myself, the transfer and relocation of the National Guard of the Morpex to Los Angeles to fight the riots, the price of the Pentagon will cost $134 million. If the U.S. suddenly wants to allocate help, then the Congress will need to take a separate budget for Ukraine, as it was done in April 24, when the last time they took $61 billion. Well, Trump still has the Biden's PDA, funding the allocation of aid and reserves of the U.S. armed forces for $1 billion, but he basically does not want to give a penny, so those $300 million, which will not or will be less in the new U.S. defense budget, this is already the case. The main thing here is that the current USAI is not redistributed to other goals, but you can see that they have already begun to do this. At the end of May, the U.S. transferred programmable non-contact explosives to the Middle East for the fight against the Shah, intended for Ukraine. As Vladimir Zelensky later said in an interview with C News, there were about 20,000 of them. So the American aid is now what remains of the last Biden's PDA, allocated in December and January, plus USAI contracts, if they are not cancelled. Everything else is in zero mode. Well, the intelligence data remains. I will add that again, we often try to find logic in the words of those or other representatives of the American administration and tie this to reality. Often we simply do not have logic. Say something just to say, for example, the nonsense of Trump about the fact that the U.S. allocated Ukraine $350 billion, which is often repeated by J.D. Vance. This is just a fiction, a literally invented amount that does not exist. But this does not prevent the American president and his administration from repeating this mantra. And Hegseth, if not the stupidest of them, is clearly in the leaders, so maybe he said it just for the sake of a beautiful dictionary. Meg electrons do not necessarily know that the U.S. did not allocate anything to Ukraine with Trump. But apparently you can get approval votes when Hegseth says that there will be even less to allocate, although it is impossible to allocate less than zero. That is, we are all in the same problem. The U.S. is too big a player to ignore the words of their high-ranking officials, but these words are not related to reality at all, so it is impossible to interpret them somehow. They are just fiction, and maybe this is one of these cases. Gensec NATO was different. Mark Rutte, and he, telling in London on June 9 about the need to rearm European NATO countries, gave a portion of, to put it mildly, strange numbers. Russia, he said, is now producing in 3 months what NATO is doing in a year: 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armored vehicles, 200 Iskaners, Rutte said. Since at least those media where I read Rutte's quotes and did not think about fact-checking them, I will have to do it. The only similar figure to the truth is the production of Iskaners, although of course it is necessary to clarify that this is about rockets, not about launchers. According to the latest GRU data, Russia produces 60-70 ballistic Iskander missiles a month. For 3 months, it will just come out about 200. Tanks and armored vehicles all look completely different. In the report of the Royal Institute of the United Forces, where Russian military industrial power is valued extremely seriously, it is said that in 1923 troops were delivered 2,100 tanks. I note that they were delivered, not produced. Speaking of the supply of armored vehicles to the USSR, it should be remembered that most of it is not new production, but the conservation of Soviet warehouses, which are already falling as the reserves are exhausted, which I talked about in a separate video. According to the same report of Russia, of 2,100 tanks delivered in 2023, only 210 were new T-90M. In general, taking into account the reduction in conservation rates as the recovery reserves are depleted, it is possible to believe in the delivery of 1,500 tanks a year, which is still immeasurably more than the deliveries of all NATO countries together. Moreover, this opinion is not only held by me, but also by one of the leading Western experts in the Russian army, Michael Kaufman. Unfortunately, he writes that these numbers are similar to each other. For example, about 1,500 is a reasonable estimate of the total annual volume of tanks, including the repaired and modernized reserves and the newly produced ones. Moreover, a relatively small part of this number is required for the new production. He wrote Kaufman on Twitter and added, his message is to motivate NATO to increase defense costs and increase the production of weapons in the right way, but comparative figures require improvement. Softly writes Kaufman, there are no exact numbers with armored vehicles, but the situation is about the same. Probably Rita just took the number of annual deliveries and, by mistake, presented it as a 3-month production, and then all this was carried out without context by the mass media. Russia, of course, poses a threat to Europe, especially in the case of the defeat of Ukraine, but this threat must be evaluated adequately, so fact-checking is the duty of journalists, whose job is to objectively inform the public. But I think you already know everything about journalists. Percentage of adequate professionals is about the same as the number of tanks produced from scratch in Russia in relation to the restored ones. That is, nothing small. This very Russian threat acquires quite a certain outline. The head of German intelligence reported Russia's readiness to send green people to Estonia. Russia intends to test the decision of NATO, including due to the expansion of confrontation with the West outside Ukraine, said the head of the Federal Intelligence Service of Germany Bruno Kohl in the Table Media podcast, writes Reiter. German intelligence has intelligence data that Russia believes that the obligations on collective defense established in the NATO agreement no longer have practical power, said Kohl. We are absolutely sure, and we have intelligence data that confirms this. Ukraine is just a step on the way to the Western direction, said the head of the BND. Russian authorities consider the possibility of confrontation that should not grow into a full-scale military collision in order to check whether the United States is really ready to fulfill its obligations provided by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, said Kohl. They do not need to send the army and tanks for this, said the head of the BND. It is enough to send small green people to Estonia to protect the allegedly oppressed Russian minority. When such an operation can begin, the head of the BND did not say. The Estonian scenario looks a bit realistic, recently stated the addition of the Tegspiegel by General Bundeswehr Eugen Joachim von Zandrart. Moscow will try to check the alliance, for example, occupying the limited territory in Estonia or Latvia. For this purpose, it would be possible to try to use the Russian-speaking minority in the Baltic countries, said the military. In his opinion, this is the most likely scenario to check the readiness of NATO to apply an article on collective defense from the Russian side. The United States is seriously concerned about the Russian threat, said Kohl, referring to contacts with American colleagues. Thank God they are seriously concerned about it as we are, he said. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in 1914 accompanied them with the capture of buildings and offices of Russian military in the form of unrecognizable signs, which they began to call green people, or Russia began to call them prudent people. Kremlin first denied its relationship with these people, but later admitted that they were Russian military. According to the 5th article of the NATO Collective Treaty, in the event of an attack on Russia on the country of the alliance participant, other NATO states will have to provide them with military aid if this is required. Unfortunately, this scenario, from my point of view, is possible, and I will explain my thought, because often when we talk about the possibility of invading Russia into other countries, there is a question from Ruslan Leviev, among others, who glorified them. This is a question of what, well, that is, how Russia can do it, because at the beginning of the war there were a lot of talks about Russia being able to invade somewhere else. Indeed, at that time, Russia did not have the potential to do this. For a full-scale invasion, Russia does not have this opportunity now. However, this is what I would like, not what I am sure of, but what option I see. I discuss it quite often with some, let's say, interlocutors. Putin has 3.5 years to check the alliance for strength while Trump is in power in the United States, showing complete strategic impotence. With little effort, you can try to arrange something. There are, however, risks for the Kremlin and colossal, and we will talk about this now, but how basic can it look? The fact is that when people imagine invading some European country, they They think that this is a scenario like with Ukraine, but this is not the case. Ukraine is a rather unique state with a huge territory, gigantic compared to other European countries, with a large population at the time of the Russian invasion, with Soviet reserves not as large as Russia, but still large. In general, Ukraine is a rather unique European state. Other states do not have this. Their army is much weaker. Moreover, Russia has been quite seriously pumped up in new types of weapons in 3.5 years of war, such as drones, which are simply not available in European countries except Ukraine. Therefore, to imagine a limited hybrid operation in Latvia, in Estonia, for example, is much more difficult in Lithuania because there are Bundeswehr brigades here. That is, there will be a direct confrontation with Germany, which Russia would not want. So to try to spread the topic with the so-called Russian nighttime, not to bring in a lot of people, but for example, to highlight a few. Units of drone operators, or to take some army corps, where to take it from a specific direction in Ukraine, simply to move, that is, in some direction to become a deft defense and temporarily relocate troops. Well, like for example, now there is a group of North troops that is engaged in attacking the Sumy. Well, as it were, to stop attacking the Sumy, to move the group of North troops, and this is for a second, there are 50-70,000 people, well, just to send to the side of Latvia or Estonia, to stand on the border and launch unidentified signs, that is, some FPV operators who will take out Estonian or Latvian military bases. Can I imagine this scenario? I can, but what can be Vladimir Putin's main calculation here, and why can he go for this? Because the time when it can go out of hand is very limited. What does it mean to go out of hand? To go out of hand means that the United States will not interfere, the United States as the main guarantor of NATO. Other European countries can try to do this, but at the moment they do not have enough weapons, trained specialists, and understanding of how to act in a modern war. And what could Putin achieve with such actions? First, to create a spark of tension. Secondly, this may lead to the fact that each European country, instead of uniting in response to Russia on the contrary, will think that it can be the next one, so it will be maximally reduced. And there, the weapons allocated for the country they will attack and for Ukraine, considering that they need to increase their own weapons as quickly as possible and increase the volume in the warehouses so that when Russia comes to them, they have the opportunity to respond. I described the worst scenario, that is, a scenario that Vladimir Putin can count on. That is, he intervenes with a limited contingent. There will be not so many ways of individual resistance in the same Estonia against the Russian army corps. Other countries will not help. At the same time, they will limit the supply of Ukraine and, for example, Estonia, to which they will attack. Sorry, Estonians, I do not consider you a priority goal. It's just that from what these analysts I have brought tell, there is exactly Estonia, and all countries in Europe are entangled in fear of sending their forces in order not to be left without pants themselves. And in the end, Vladimir Putin improves the situation in the war in Ukraine, and accordingly he sees that the 5th article of NATO no longer works. This leads to the fact that countries, in principle, are falling apart. That is, there is such atomization because now everyone believes that it is for themselves. This scenario has big problems, it has colossal risks. If something goes wrong, as Putin can plan in this scenario, then everything will collapse at the moment. Well, for example, the first risk is that Trump can easily rethink. He often does the opposite of what he promises. So he planned to recordly reduce the defense budget, and in the end, the Pentagon will receive a record trillion. So here too, the public rhetoric and the main action of Trump at the moment can change. Moreover, Ukraine will also not go anywhere and can also transfer part of the troops to reflect the Russian attack, respectively, already in the European country. And such an attack will give Europe a legitimate right to go into a real war with Russia and its allies. For example, without any problems, take Kaliningrad. This can be done very, very quickly, which is absolutely defenseless. This enclave has no opportunity to resist, well, even if it is the Lithuanian or Latvian army. In general, there will be no possibility for Kaliningrad to defend itself. It will also be possible to go to Transnistria, stop and simply start to drown all Russian ships in the Baltics. Belarus, again, is quite a possible goal. In short, this is already a direct world war. and a border operation in Latvia on which other countries will not react is problematic to imagine. But I would consider this threat seriously, since Putin can believe that there will be no other chance. And all crazy ideas need to be checked while Trump is in power. The conclusion for Europe is simple. The stronger Ukraine and the unity of Europe, the less chances Putin has to attack NATO countries or at least succeed in this. But this scenario can be considered because, again, many people think that Putin is crazy and crazy. This is not true. He has his own idea of what he wants, and from the point of view of what he wants, there is a part of the steps that can help him in this under certain circumstances. The main idea of Vladimir Putin and the main thing he is counting on is the destruction of the unity of the West. And his big mistake was, during the invasion of Ukraine, that he overestimated the destruction of the West, overestimated the destruction within Ukraine. But he still believes that he can wait. He still believes that he can sit down. He still believes that the actions that he performs in order to split the West and, in principle, everything that he does not like, that he has resources for this time. I think she is wrong, but nevertheless, all scenarios must be taken into account. The center of dossiers again, by the way, recalls that the Russian threat to Europe is already here, even without any mythical 1,500 tanks. The UAVs, presumably associated with Russia, are launched from civilian ships over military infrastructure facilities in Europe. It is not yet possible to catch them from the European authorities. On the night of May 17, the German patrol ship Pazda followed the Russian cargo ship Laga. However, the German patrol itself suddenly began to pursue all the UAVs. Such a strange procession continued for 3 hours. Later, in the Belgian city of Zabriug, the ship Laga was checked. The crew turned out to be completely Russian, but the drones on the ship were not found. However, Laga was involved in a suspicious journey. In the summer of 1924, the ship was carried away by the cargo of the Syrian Tartus, and turning off the radar when entering the port, they paid attention to the dossier. At that time, the Russian military base was operating in the port of Tartus. The owner of the Laga ship is associated with the cooperation of Rosatom. Just a month ago, another ship of the same owner also went to Tartus. Experts record the growing number of flights, presumably associated with Russia, of drones over European infrastructure and military facilities. In just one period, from February 27 to March 7, 1925, UAVs flew over double naval bases, ports, and chemical enterprises in Germany almost every day. But it is quite difficult to catch drones launched from ships, because the decomposing UAVs can be hidden on a large cargo ship or simply drowned in the sea after a flight, European experts remind. Therefore, the war with Russia is already going on. At least Russia is at war with Europe, and Europe is afraid of everything and is afraid of escalation. Russian ships should simply be drowned. Well, try to arrest. If it does not work, then drown, because this is literally a Russian military machine. Intelligence is part of military action. And to good news, the European Commission reported that it will enter the 18th package of sanctions against Russia. It is expected that new restrictions will hit 2 key sectors, energy and banking, said the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. In particular, all transactions related to the Northern Stream 1 and the Northern Stream 2, the reduction of the price ceiling on oil to $45, the blocking of another 77 ships of the Shadow Fleet, the ban on the import of products from Russian oil. Also, a complete ban on transactions with 22 Russian banks and financial institutions in the third countries, which help bypass the sanctions, is proposed. Export of technologies of double purpose used in the production of weapons is prohibited. Our signal is very clear: this war must end. Since today Russia does not show readiness to achieve peace, we will increase the pressure on it, including by introducing further tough sanctions, said von der Leyen. Some of these sanctions really look pretty tough. The question is how and when they will be adopted, in what form, what Hungary will do. Well, in general, a standard set of questions to European sanctions. However, the pressure on Russia, of course, must be increased, especially given that Russia is in a very difficult economic situation, which is getting worse every day. But the main thing to remember is that the main obstacle for Russia is the Ukrainian army, which continues to resist the fascist occupation army of Russia and Russian aggression. Therefore, we continue to support the Ukrainian military and help them with the assembly of various necessary things. Thus, we continue to assemble a car for the 151st Intelligence Battalion. I remind you of their address to you. I wish you good health. We are the pilots of the 151st Separate Intelligence Strike Battalion. We ask Mike Nacke and his subscribers to help us collect money for the car. You have already helped us. We are very grateful to you, but we again have such a need. We believe in your help. Thank you. USDT TRC20, that is, cryptocurrency. And let's help the Ukrainian intelligence officers to survive by transport, which will help them fulfill their tasks. Well, now let's move on to the Ukrainian blow. The raid of Ukrainian drones on Russian objects continues in the VPK. VPA attacks the Tambov powder factory in Khodovsk, local residents say. Main activity of the Tambov powder factory is the production of explosive substances. It is one of the largest in Russia, the manufacturer of powder for firearms and artillery ammunition. As Commerçant wrote, the enterprise produces more than 200 types of products, including pyroxylene powder for firearms, hand grenades, grenade launchers, artillery, and mortar ammunition. It is part of the Rose Tech State Corporation. Here is a video from local residents.
Завод горит. Нет, не завод. Может, завод. Завод.
There, I remind you, friends, please do not make the video like that. In the area, you can quickly geolocate from which specific apartment the shooting took place. Therefore, either learn how to process and blur the video so that it does not come out on you, or send it to the reliable team of messengers who will do all the necessary work for you. This is a question of your safety, since Russia terrifies people who record the loss of objects. Here is another video from the series of explosions and perhaps. Yes, from the forest. Whoa, where is the PVO? What the fuck, why PVO does not shoot? That's it, look, now it will bang. For any reason, sit down, look at the map. Oh, there is a contact, and fell. By the way, the question about PVO is asked not only by the guys from the garages, but by these in cores. I talked about this in yesterday's video. And this video from the garages is very atmospheric. You understand that the guys were just drinking until the morning and meeting the dawn, their summer romance. The consequences of the Ukrainian Operation the Sparrow continue to be felt. The Russian airbase Olnya, as of June 7, left all the bombers Tu-95, and there are questions about the working condition of the remaining bombers Tu-22. Its conclusion, after analysis of satellite images, the AFU investigator MT Anderson came and on June 10 published the corresponding post on Twitter. The airbase Olnya in the Murmansk region continues to be cleaned up after the super successful strikes of Ukraine. Photos taken on June 5-7 show what exactly remained of the airbase. One plane Tu-95 flew on June 5-7. It was gone. There are still a few Tu-22, but who knows which of them is currently in working condition, he wrote. Of course, the further the Russian bombers have to fly to the launch point of the rocket, the faster it will lead to the exhaustion of the remaining resources of the ships and further weakening of the rocket shelling. Well, the more time Ukraine will have from the moment of the arrival of information about the preparing attack to the flights themselves, which will make it more effective to counteract the shelling. And a little more about the consequences of the Ukrainian strikes, which, as usual, become known a few days later. The attack of the Ukrainian Defense Force on the oil basin in Gels was more effective than was previously considered. This is evidenced by the new satellite images which the Ukrainian newspaper NV received. In the photos from June 10, you can see the destruction or critical damage of at least 5 or 7 fuel reservoirs, which are twice as many as were previously considered. On June 7, NV published satellite images that recorded the consequences of the attack on Gels. In the photos, you could see a large-scale fire destruction. However, due to the large hailstorm that stretched for tens of kilometers, it was impossible to estimate the scale of the destruction. Also, satellite images confirm a successful attack by the BPL on the Nair Progress plant in the city of Chibksar on the territory of the Chuvash Republic of the Russian Federation, which is 975 kilometers from the state border of Ukraine. As of June 10, due to the low quality of the frames, it was difficult to estimate the scale of the destruction. However, on the roof of one of the buildings there were traces of a fire with the same quality of the frames as there are. The fire is difficult to notice immediately, however, the changes become obvious in comparison with satellite images before the BPL attack. Russia, in the meantime, they continue to apply the method of protection against Ukrainian strikes, which is similar to how a child closes his eyes with his palms and believes that since he sees nothing, he is now not visible. Yandex and Double Geese have removed from their maps the designation associated with the defense industry complex of Russia, notice to drill. Among them are powder chemical and aviation plants. The links to the location of most of the enterprises are still available in Google search results. However, when switching to Yandex Maps and Double Geese, a message appears that nothing has been found or that the organization has been removed from the file. In fact, it should be clear clear from this that this is not the case with this plan. If a certain enterprise in Russian maps is blurred, then it can be understood that it is important for the Russian VPC. And then, with the help of Google or the services for the purchase of satellite images, see what is there and strike. As Verska found out, Yandex and Double Geese deleted information about the location of at least 12 enterprises, in particular, the Tambov powder plant, the Murom device factory, the design bureau of Radugin, Dubna, and others. Previously, Yandex began to blur the defense enterprises on the maps. However, some enterprises with remote image settings still have, for example, the Murom device factory. In some cases, even the enterprise's addresses were removed from the map. For example, the Murom device factory is located on the Marshansky Highway, 36 in Tambov. On Yandex Maps, this address is not located. As Verska found out in February 25, the prosecutor's office tried to force Yandex to delete the images of its enterprises, Murom device factory and Tambov powder plant on the maps through a court hearing. Sorry, in both cases, the searches were returned to the prosecutor, and it was recommended to turn to the court for the location of registration of Yandex. At the same time, the images of these enterprises on the maps were still blurred. Thanks to the Russian authorities for such a wonderful plan. Now Ukrainian planners will be able to confirm potential goals much easier simply by blurring them. Well, of course, all these maps have been uploaded a long time ago, and the factory cannot be moved for one night, so the meaning of this action slips away from me. Well, where can I go before the Russian generals? It is known the consequences of not only Ukrainian strikes, but also of Russian attacks on the cities of Ukraine. On the night of June 10, Kiev, Odessa, Chernigivskaya, and Dnipropetrovskaya oblasts were attacked. Vladimir Zelensky called the attack on the capital one of the largest. In Odessa, as a result of the raid, 2 civilians were killed by drones, 9 people were injured. One of the blows came from the building of the maternity home, as I told you yesterday. The Odessa film studio and the destroyed decoration of the film Davzhenka were also damaged. This was reported by the Minister of Culture and Strategic Communications of Ukraine, Nikolai Tekitsky. In Kiev, 1 person died, 4 people were injured at once. Fire broke out in several areas of the city. Damage was inflicted by several cars, residential and non-residential buildings, as well as by the Hagia Sophia Cathedral, a monument of the national value of the 11th century. The explosion damaged the cornice, the main spire of the temple. During the extinguishing of the fires, the rescuers used the fire helicopter K-32 transferred to Portugal. Russia is developing its capabilities for long-range strikes, including thanks to cooperation with the DPRK. The North Korean ballistic missiles KN-23 have significantly improved, and now they're striking targets with deadly accuracy, said Budinov. In an interview with Warzone, the head of the city added that the first batch of KN-23 delivered to Russia was of poor quality, and according to the reports of the Ukrainian prosecutor's office, about half of the missiles not only deviated from the trajectory, but also exploded in the air. In addition, Budinov emphasized that the RF will help the DPRK to establish the production of kamikaze drones in its territory, such as the Shad, apparently. Now let's get to the line of contact. In the Sumy direction, the State Department fixes the progress in the RF in the area of Yablanovka and Yunakovka. Ukrainian military advisor Konstantin Mashevez writes that in the Sumy direction, a large part of the Russian army group, Kursk, is involved, with the given divisions from other areas of responsibility in the current group, North. According to his data, recently the Russians managed to advance to 800-1200 meters at various areas of the LBS in the Sumy region. However, the Ukrainian defense forces were able to counterattack, throwing off the enemy from the northern Yunakovka and southern Olshnia. In fact, the counterattacks were materialized, which were hinted at by the Ukrainian military, which we discussed with you. In the counterattack, the Ukrainian forces are confirmed from the Russian side. For example, this is what the Z analyst Anatoly Radov wrote. Subsequently, however, they removed the post. In 1983, the VDV brigade, by the way, writes that while they came out from Yablanovka, small villages came out, the work is going, but it happened so. The Ukrainian forces continue to strike on the Russian rear in the Kursk region. Project War Archive describes the video battalions of the Pentagon 225th Separate Assault Regiment Unmanned Systems. Having discovered enemy equipment in the garage, the Ukrainian FV drone operators successfully bypassed the obstacles with their kamikaze drones and destroyed the armored vehicle in the SRF Linza, the village of Karavyakhovka, the Kursk region. Let's talk a little about how the Russian offensive is taking place in the Susky direction from the point of view of its participants. The military officer from the RLA call wrote an urgent video message in which he told about the insolence of the commanders of the 48th Separate Guard Brigade of the Navy with the call Shershny. He claims that his close fighter with the call, Afghan, contacted him and told about what happened to them after the assault in the Susky direction. They stormed the village of Kondrativka. They sent 100 people to their company. 8 survived. Because they survived, the commander told them that they were 500 and that they were hiding. We absolutely do not care whether they raised the flag or not. We all have to die. None of you should have survived. The commander of this Shershny is the military unit 10,103. The soldier with the call RLA asked to distribute his address and emphasized that such commanders should not live. Yes, this is my personal address. I need to send the creature to the front line or to the 0 line right away. Now the guys not letting the guys have a break, they gathered all our guys who could, 200. Someone was dragged back to the side of the PVD to the zero line where they were taken from the group of guys. They are now told that they are 500. For fuck's sake, they survived. That they were supposed to die like dogs. This is what the commander of this Shershani says. He also said that his comrades reported that the Shershani from the military unit 10,103 did not allow the survivors to have a rest and sent them back to the assault. The guys for 1 week were without food, without water, and the command said, "You won't get anything." They didn't even send water with drops. Now they are sent back to the assault. They are yelling, "You will still die." The RLA hopes that someone from the command will see this address and Shershani will bear the responsibility and punishment for their actions. So the RLA is such actions are absolutely approved by the Russian command, because this is the only way you can be sent to suicide assaults. Therefore, if you say that the commander should not live, you take a machine gun, go and shoot at him, because you have no other chance to survive. But however, the selflessness of Russian soldiers has already been discussed with us more than once, and they are ready to go to die, record tearful videos in the hope that a friend of the magician will come and save them. You will not be saved, you will die, like many of your coworkers. In the Pokrovsky direction, the deep state marks the progress of the Russians in the area of Malinovka on the eastern flank. Also, the project gives context to the video that appeared on the days when 3 Russian soldiers are supposedly wandering in the Dnipropetrovsk region. In recent days, more and more footage with attempts by the enemy to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region of the Russians has appeared. From the video of the 200th, the deep state is noted. In fact, as expected, another group of Russian soldiers died for the sake of a video in social networks. According to the units that carry defense there, the Russians storm every day. Strikes are made on them both at the stages of the movement and during the storm actions themselves, analysts say. Konstantin Masheves says that on the eastern flank of the Pokrovsky direction, the deep state attacks in the direction of Yablonka and Poltevka, including attracting additional forces from the Turetsky direction. However, so far they have managed to move only 1.5 or 1 in 7 kilometers south of Popova Yar. On the western flank, Masheves admits that the front units of the 90th Tank Division at the administrative border of the Dnipropetrovsk region are south of Kotlyrovka. At the neighboring section, the Russians managed to approach Novozorjivka from the east when the Ukrainian Defense Force successfully counterattacked the eastern Novonivlivka, he reports. Ukrainian military has told about the reflection of Russian attempts to enter the village of Kamer in the southern Donetsk direction, and this is what the author of the Telegram channel officer wrote about it. Enemies entered the village of Kamer, but most of them did not leave there. There are corpses lying in the eastern part of the village. Attempts to secure themselves there were unsuccessful, but from the south they are still trying to get through. His colleague Stanislav Bunyatov adds that the USSR has suffered losses not only in life force, but also in equipment, which is a great rarity in today's times. Russia did not want to fly into Kamer on 3 tanks. 2 of them, the guys from Dash V, effectively, fried, however, also effectively, Bunyatov writes. Konstantin Masheves writes that the Ukrainian Defense Force continues to hold part of Constantinople and Baghteria, and they also carry out persistent battles in Atridny and Alexivka. At the same time, he warns that a successful advance of the enemy in Alexivka can force the Ukrainian forces to leave this whole area. At the same time, the latter Mashevets, the Ukrainian managed to knock out the enemy from Fedorovka and throw him 1 kilometer away from Kamer. The Western Defense Force of Ukraine continues to keep the fun, keeping the threat of counterattacks on the left flank of the Russian forces advancing to Fedorovka from Dnipropetrovsk. On the Limansky direction, the fights are going on all over the perimeter of Platsdarma, on the right bank of the river Zherobets, says Mashevets. He believes that the Russian forces are trying to go abroad to the Peskioritkovsk-Lazovo and bypass the Ukrainian Defense Force from the south, which keeps defense along the Novogorovka-Grekovka border. At the same time, according to Mashevets, the Ukrainians successfully counterattacked in the region of Karpovka, moving the enemy for 500 meters from the village. Here the Russians plan to advance to the Lemons, in the future creating a threat to Seversk and then to Slavinsk, but so far they have not succeeded. In the Kupinsk direction, according to the information of Mashevets, the USSR still took over the border village of Strovka and started fighting for Kondrashevka to the north of Kupinsk on the right bank of the river Oskol. According to him, the Russian command seeks to expand Platsdarm to the north of the city at any cost. This, as Mashevets noted earlier, in the future should give the Russians the opportunity to attack both Kupinsk itself and the Great Burlak along the border. In the meantime, in connection with the Russian offensive in all the settlements of the Kharkov region, it was declared mandatory evacuation due to the intensification of enemy shelling, reports the local OVA. It is about the settlements of the Kupinsk region: Baranovka, Berezovka, Novonikolivka, Spodobovka, Starovorovka, Duvenka, and Fedrovka. The message says, "Excuse me if I pronounce some of them incorrectly." Telling the situation in the northern part of the Kharkov region, Mashevitz tells about the advance of the Ukrainian Defense Force 400 meters to Volchansk, where he managed to restore control over the territory of the aggregate plant again. Russians, according to Mashevitz, also tried to assault Volchansk, as well as in the direction of Lipsa and Staritsa, trying to bypass the city on the flanks. Speaking of the situation in the area of Chasiv Yar, Konstantin Mashevitz fixes the attacks of the enemy in Chasiv Yar and in the area of Stupachek, south of the city. However, the only success of Russian assault actions is the expansion of the control zone along the North Donetsk-Donbass channel 400 meters. This direction should be considered as an auxiliary for the offensive on Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk, while the main blow is carried out by the Russian troops from the south at the junction of the Pokrovsky and Turetsky directions. The Zaporozhsky direction we will now transfer to it in the Malinovka region. Until recently, the Russian assault actions continue in the Kom section of the front, so far, fortunately, without serious success. The details are provided by Deep State. The enemy continues the assault actions on Malinovka, analysts write. Fortunately for us, the Russians have not yet managed to achieve the main goal of quickly taking Malinovka. Enemy was able to capture part of the gray zone and advance from the east in the direction of the village. It is noteworthy that on the last Sunday there was another activation of the assault actions, because on such areas of the front, on Sundays, the Russians are usually considered a day off. Activation at this part of the front indicates the enemy's plans to create a clash for the capture of the walking field from the east, Deep State believes. According to the field marshal, the enemy managed to advance 400 meters in the direction of Malinovka. Now let's move on to the figures and statistics. The Okogora channel publishes another infographic of the intensity of the fights over the past week, from the 2nd to the 8th of June, according to the General Staff of the Soviet Union. According to this data, the average number of fighting encounters compared to the previous week has practically not changed, and even increased by 2%. At the same time, the number of Russian attacks on the Pokrovsk, Turetsky, Yuzhnodonetsk, and Sumsk regions has increased by much more, from 8% to 18%, apparently due to secondary directions. The number of assaults on the opposite side has decreased. If such a trend is preserved, it will turn out that Russia is concentrating efforts on promising directions to achieve operational success there, ideally for them the breakthrough of the Ukrainian front. As for the advance on the front, it continues to accelerate, although there is no talk of any fast pace. According to the Okogor data, on the same period from the 2nd to the 8th of May, the USSR captured 156 square kilometers, mostly on the same Pokrovsk, Turetsky, Sumsk, and Yuzhnodonetsk. Directions promoting an average of 22 square kilometers per day and 18 per week before that. Now the task of the Soviet Union is to contain the offensive in these four directions, around which it is possible that the main events of the Russian summer offensive will probably unfold, which I talked about in a separate video. An important feature of this offensive, which I have already mentioned, is that it takes place with minimal technical support, mainly in the form of an attack on foot and on motorcycles, bugs, and other junk. Actually, this can be seen from the graph of Russian technical losses from the Warspotting project, where the losses in May, at the beginning of the offensive, did not increase, but instead decreased compared to April, which was less than the indicators of the 23rd year, when Russia did not advance but defended itself. This offensive will inevitably be connected with huge losses of the personnel, as it actually took place in the First World War, the last war that took place without the mass use of armored vehicles. Then Russia lasted 3 years. Let's see how long it will last this time. In the channel of the Ukrainian unit Signum, yesterday celebrated a historical date, 3 years since the day of the first use of the PV drone. Yes, that's how much, although the mass of them became known in the 23rd year, the first steps were made in the summer of the first year of the war. On June 10, 1922, the day that opened a new era on the battlefield, they write, 3 years ago, on this day, the pilots of the Signum were the first in Ukraine to successfully use the PV drone in battle. It was 1922 when the full-scale war was only gaining momentum. Then there was no flow of PV, and most did not even imagine that the drone could be a weapon. Signum made a breakthrough. It was not just a blow, it was a moment that opened a new era on the battlefield, an era of accuracy, innovation, and thinking a few steps forward, they rightly write in the channel Signum. Yesterday, the second stage of the exchange of prisoners of war took place, according to the agreements in Istanbul. After returning home, seriously ill and seriously wounded fighters returned home. The details are provided by Deep State. As part of the agreements in Istanbul, the traditional headquarters on the issue of treatment of prisoners of war freed a group of defenders from Russian captivity, who were seriously injured and suffering from serious health problems. Among the freed military personnel of the SSU, including representatives of the Navy, Land Forces, TRO, Assault Troops, State Border Services, National Guard, and State Special Services of Transport. In the current exchange, the defenders of Mariupol, who had been captured for more than 3 years, return home. In addition to the representatives of the soldiers and sergeants, officers were also released, says Deep State. All freed defenders have severe injuries and serious diseases, amputated limbs, problems with vision, abscesses, infections, injuries, fractional wounds, chronic diseases, and the participation of the freed are diagnosed with hepatitis and tuberculosis. The freed will be delivered to medical centers to undergo all necessary tests and sent for further treatment and medical rehabilitation. They will all be provided with the necessary help. They will be restored with documents and paid the necessary money for the time spent in captivity. The large-scale exchange of prisoners continues. According to the safety considerations, the exact number of freed will be announced after the completion of all operations. Ukraine consistently works on the implementation of the exchange formula of all on all in all categories. Such an exchange is really one of the most important tasks because all new evidence of what is happening to Ukrainian military in the Russian captivity appears. A photo of a freed Ukrainian prisoner of war appeared on the network, on whose body the Russians cut out or burned the words on the inscription, "Glory to Russia." The deputy head of the correctional headquarters, Andrew Yusupov, confirmed the authenticity of the photo and said that he, during the examination of the defender, made a lie that could not stand what he saw. Unfortunately, this is a real photo, he writes. This is from one of the previous exchanges. The doctor, during the examination in one of the regional centers where the guys undergo rehabilitation, simply could not stand it, photographed it, and posted it on the network. This is evidence of what our defenders go through, he said. The prisoners, in connection with the appearance of this photo, did not miss the opportunity to demonstrate once again that they finally lost their human appearance. Here, for example, what the channel Veterans Notes wrote, to whose post the investigator Ivan Filipov paid attention. At the beginning of the war in the spring of 1922, the Ukrainian Nazi bastards first opened the Pandora's box. Everyone remembers how Kraken shot the prisoners and soldiers of the USSR, and how they cut the throat of our guys under Kiev, and how they pierced a knife into the eye of our prisoners, and when they shot the prisoners who surrendered to the Makiivki are mobilized ones, which can be found on each such case of the Ukrainian side from dozens of Russian. Of course, the prisoner is silent, and he just invented some of them. And all this at a time when the USSR in every possible way adhered to the conventional rules of war. Literally, this is also a lie. From the first day, falling asleep with cassette rockets of Kharkov and Avdiivka, and until the last one they behaved indecently, writes Zetka. And finally, about the serfdom in the Russian troops. Do not try to leave the Russian army in any way except for deserting or surrender to captivity. You will most likely not get anything. Military officer Alexander Alexandrovich, who served in the 6th Guards Tank Regiment, signed a contract in September 1922 with a term of 6 months, after which he was sent to the SVO zone. According to the extension of the contract, Alexander repeatedly submitted reports on dismissal, but every time he received a refusal. The reason for the dismissal from the military service was not only the term of the contract, but also the family circumstances. The man is the guardian of his sick sister. I have repeatedly received reports on dismissal due to serious family circumstances, and in addition, I am officially the guardian. My own sick sister, Invalida, the first group. From the words of the military officer, all his reports were ignored by the commander of the regiment, Abim Islamov, and the head of the headquarters, Belyanin. They're also trying to send Alexander back to the combat zone. The military officer already appealed to the military prosecutor's office, but there were no answers. The man believes that the military prosecutor's office in the city of Chibarkul covers the illegal actions of the commander of the military unit 930-992. In addition, they are trying to send me back to the special military operations zone. All the necessary documents were delivered to the military unit by me and my right-hand man. The military prosecutor's office in the city of Chibarkul was sent. There were no answers from their side. In addition, the military prosecutor's office in the city of Chibarkul covers the illegal actions of the commander of the unit. The soldier reported that he and other military officers who got into a similar situation are kept in a barracks under the protection of the military police. I and other military officers who got into a similar situation are kept in a barracks under the protection of the military police. Therefore, we consider our presence here an illegal deprivation of freedom. Well, as you know, nothing good is shining on him, and all these things are part of the Russian system. You know, as they usually say, the entry of the ruble is the exit too, so the entrance to the Russian army is paid to you, but the exit is basically impossible. This was Michael Nacke. See you soon. All the best. Bye.